color. Hunters became the hunted.
I feel bad to this day. I'm always going to feel bad because we knew there was grizzlies. I knew there was grizzlies there.
A half-ton of terror that can kill a horse with a single blow. What chance would a lone teenager have against a grizzly bear?
I thought about the fact that I'd taken one of our children up on the mountain and maybe I wasn't going to bring him home.
The day of the grizzly, the night of fear.
Dateline with Jane Pauley and Stone Phillips, plus Tom Brokaw, Katie Couric, Bryant Gumbel, and Maria Shriver. From studio.
Watching a grizzly in a zoo or in the safety of your own home is one thing. Meeting one of these half-ton, always hungry giants alone on a mountaintop in Montana is something else altogether. It happened to a teenager whose family feared the worst. Here's Keith Morrison with the latest chapter in the legend of the grizzly. Tonight's second Dateline Survivor story.
Why don't you tell them the story?
About bloodhead trees?
Yeah.
They trade tales in their magic night circle, bring comfort in the cold and dark. They've come here to draw the sting from their own terrible story. The one that begins in a small town in eastern Montana, a speck on the map called Broadus. They say you have to be tough to grow up in Broadus, a town where the winters are harsh and livings are made on muscle and sweat.
Get up here.
Kurt Olson planned to break from this hard work of his, a special vacation with his son who had just graduated high school.
This trip was going to be one that we was going to remember forever, and boy, I tell you what, we sure did. Never forget that hunting trip.
What made it so memorable? Kurt Olson invited some friends, sheep-shearing buddies, including an avid young outdoorsman, 18-year-old Bram Schaefer, and his father, Dennis, who was in for far more than the simple pleasures he expected.
We talk and tell stories and build fires and just enjoy life.
This is where they came, Horseshoe Mountain, a glorious place deep in the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness, a world away from civilization or even a paved road. They came to hunt elk and absorb the perfect quiet, but mostly to pause here together before the sons went on with their lives.
It was different than anything for me because we were taking our sons. You know, I mean, a guy waits to take his son on a trip like this once in a lifetime.
And here it is almost indescribably beautiful, spiritual, still unscarred by its human visitors, and blooming with new life 8 years after the great Yellowstone fire.
They knew, of course, that though man intrudes here as everywhere, the real king of the beasts in these forests is the grizzly bear. 400 to 1,000 pounds of ferocious power, 35 miles an hour, could kill a horse with a single blow. Jaws so powerful, could snap through a tree like that in a single bite. They knew this and were prepared, but no one could know what would happen.
We knew there was grizzlies. I knew there was grizzlies in there.
There are perhaps 1,000 grizzly bears in Montana, like these in Yellowstone. They're omnivorous. They'll eat practically anything. For the most part, they're afraid of humans. But when they feel threatened, they lash out, sometimes with grave consequences. Grizzlies can outrun any human and are so strong they can carry away a 1,000-pound elk. But the hunters weren't worried. Why would they be? You're more likely to be struck by lightning than be attacked by a grizzly bear. Besides, their trip seemed blessed.
We got off to a very good start. We had a wonderful hunt, had wonderful weather.
About 4 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, they came here to Paradise to take one last shot at an elk before heading home. They fanned out from this meadow, each heading off in a different direction.
I know from past experiences I should have had us paired up, you know, right within 30 feet, you know, and that was a big mistake.
Kurt sent Bram over there, over the top of the ridge. Bram's father, Dennis, took a shorter route back to camp.
In fact, one of the last things Bram did was he turned and smiled at me and then turned and over the mountain he went, hunting.
They all knew they were pushing the limit. It was late in the day to be starting a hunt. Then, as darkness fell, the weather took a sharp turn. It started to rain. The temperature plunged. One by one, the hunters, now cold and soaked to the skin, returned to camp. But no Bram. He was the quickest walker, so they were surprised, then concerned. By the time Dennis straggled in last, he was greeted by rising panic.
Bram wasn't in yet. And I said, what's going on here, guys? Bram's not in. Everybody else is in, and Bram's not in. And I knew there was something wrong. And by the time I got my horse saddled, it was snowing.
Kurt and the rest of the hunters waited in camp. They knew that even if Bram had survived some disaster, the weather could kill him.
My guts churned. I prayed. Mostly I prayed to give me a chance to find him alive. I wanted the chance.
Because you felt responsible for him.
I was. I sent him around the mountain. I was responsible.
And now the storm was getting much worse. The rain had turned to sleet, and then snow. Snow so thick, Dennis was forced to return to camp without his youngest son.
I spent the night pacing and walking. I thought about the fact that I'd taken one of our children up on the mountain, and maybe I wasn't going to bring him home.
As the hunters waited and prayed by the fire, two men they'd never met were on their way back to their own camp on the other side of the mountain.
I said, Bryce, you know, this would be a great time to see how these muzzle loaders work.
Bruce Pisecki and his son were late getting back to their camp when they stopped to see if their old-fashioned guns would fire in the foul weather. Bruce showed us how.
And it was like minutes, maybe seconds later, we heard a shot up in the woods.
Bruce, thinking the shot was fired by another hunter in his party, walked toward the gunshot. And what he heard then was chilling.
It was frantic yelling. It wasn't just somebody saying, hello, I'm over here.
What did you hear? What did he yell?
Well, the last time we could hear him and understand him, he said, help me, I've been attacked by a grizzly bear. And I just chilled.
It was Bram, or what was left of him.
He almost looked like a monster. I mean, he just looked like something I've never seen before. There was so much steam coming off of him, and he was standing there about like this, just doing this. And he had so much blood down in front of his face. When he was talking, the bubbles were coming out of his mouth.
Bram's scalp was torn to the bone, his arm and shoulder ripped, his hand a punctured claw. But worst, the flesh of his left thigh had been shredded. He was tottering, incoherent, and he reeked the foul smell of grizzly. Bruce decided to try to carry him to camp. This was Herculean. The forest floor was a tangled trap of trees felled by the great fire.
Couldn't have been the worst night. And every time I'd lift my leg to carry him over a tree that had been falling down, my legs would split out from underneath me because of the weight. I even had my buckles snap on my boots because I had so much weight on my back.
As Bruce and Bram were struggling down the mountain, a doctor who happened to be camped in the meadow below heard their shots. On the side of this mountain, in the middle of nowhere, was Dr. Andy Wolf, a podiatrist who had trained in an urban trauma unit.
We grabbed some slickers and some lanterns, some flashlights, and a medical kit, and went up on the hill. And our pistols as well.
And what they found there was a horror.
This right here is where we found him. Bram was standing at that time, looked real cold, he was shivering, and covered from head to toe with blood.
When you saw what that leg looked like, what do you think?
I was really concerned, but I tried to tell Bram that everything was fine, and he was a little shocky. He was real shivering bad, and he was beginning to get a little shocky.
Back at camp, the doctor gave Bram a narcotic to dull the pain and search for something to bind Bram's wounds. He had little more than burlap and duct tape. He used it. Two other hunters were sent plowing through the snow to the ranger station. Dr. Wolf tried to keep Bram from going into shock. He watched with growing despair as signs of gangrene began to appear. It can travel 6 inches an hour, destroying tissue as it rolls through the body. But an even more urgent problem was throbbing visibly in Bram's thigh. The main artery was exposed, perhaps damaged. If it broke, Bram would be dead in minutes.
Did you think you were dealing with a dead man at this point?
I thought if that artery busted open, we were in deep trouble.
On the other side of the mountain, Bram's family and friends still didn't know where he was, or whether he was dead or alive.
We held each other, we cried, we prayed.
At daybreak, they set out again to try to find Bram. Soon after the search began, Kurt ran into the two men who had ridden through the night to find the ranger.
They said, we have Bram. And I wept like a child. I mean, that was, to me, one of the, I'll never forget it. I reached over and I grabbed that guy off his horse and I kissed him.
Then he signaled Bram's father.
And we heard the 4 shots from Kurt, and waited 20 seconds and the 5th shot.
Which meant he'd been found.
I was so relieved. We all yahooed, you know, and we scattered rocks as we went down the mountain on our horses.
We knew it was going to be bad. How bad, we didn't know until we hit the bottom of the switchbacks that day. And they gave us his clothes, and they were just mangled to bits.
Just said, oh my God.
Dennis wasn't able to see his son before a chopper finally picked him up from this meadow that morning. His wife was at home when the phone rang.
Of all the calls that you get about your children, I couldn't fathom that one of my children was just lunch for a bear, you know. It was too hard.
Cheryl Schaefer flew 2.5 hours down the highway to Billings St. Vincent Hospital, where she was met by a doctor.
He said, your son has gastrus gangrene, and I just kind of grabbed his hands and I said, no, I don't think so. And he said that this is a really bad infection that moves really fast, and that Bram's been too long out in the mountain without help. And he told me that he was going to go into surgery, but not to...
Not to what?
Not to hold any hope, because he didn't think he'd come out.
An eyewitness account of the attack and young Bram's fight for life when we return.
After these messages from your local station.
Returning to our story, a young man alone on a mountain has been all but torn to shreds by a grizzly bear. As he's taken into surgery, he has a moment with his mom, who's been told this could be goodbye. Once again, here's Keith Morrison.
I didn't want him to know how bad he was. And he took one look at me and he says, don't start with me, Mother. I have things to do. I said, okay. And I think from then on I thought, okay.
But Bram was in very bad shape. Doctors were able to close his head wound and repair the football-sized bite the bear had taken from under his arm. But the mangled leg with its galloping gangrene was a critical problem. Doctors warned the Schaefers that if Bram survived at all, he'd likely lose his leg.
I knew that he was a fighter. He always has been a fighter.
Bram survived the surgery, but the infection was still roaring through his body. So he was placed inside this hyperbaric chamber to try to kill the gangrene. It seemed to be working, but suddenly his heart rate plunged. He lost consciousness. The pure oxygen that was being used to heal his leg was making him critically ill.
They had to stick him back in, and he had a bad night.
But something kept him going that night. The cussed toughness bred in rugged eastern Montana? Maybe. Or maybe his mother, standing by.
I looked at him and I thought, no, you're not dying in no oxygen chamber. So I just kissed him and I said goodnight.
Bram Schaefer survived the bear, the mountain, the storm, gangrene, and oxygen toxicity. And after 3 surgeries, skin grafts, weeks in the hospital, he went home, his leg intact. And he told us the part of the story that only he could tell, harrowing moments that went beyond terror and extraordinary survival.
I just think maybe if I stayed in bed like I wanted to, I wouldn't have had to go. I wouldn't have gotten in trouble.
If you stayed in bed like you wanted to?
Yeah, we were taking an afternoon nap, and Kurt come over and kicked the side of the tent. You going with us? Oh, all right, you know.
Think of the adventure you would have missed.
Yeah. Could have done without it.
What he can now call his adventure began about an hour after he and the other hunters fanned out from the top of Horseshoe Mountain. Bram was walking through the woods, alone, his gun at his side, looking for sign of elk. He hadn't shot a thing when suddenly the silence was broken by the sound of snapping branches.
I was just looking down at the ground, and I look up, and I didn't focus or anything, and I see a big blurry thing and a little blurry thing charging toward me.
Bram knew right away what those blurs were, even though he'd never seen a grizzly before. Now, without the hint of a warning, he was being attacked by one of the most dangerous animals on the planet, a mother bear protecting her young cub.
I took about 4 steps and she nailed me. Next thing I know, she's got her head between my legs, looking at me, just breathing.
Female grizzlies weigh close to 400 pounds and have 4-inch claws that slash with incredible force. Some advice: if a bear attacks, the best thing to do is curl into a ball and play dead. Bram didn't know this. His brain was spinning, adrenaline pumping. He was pinned under the weight of the panting bear.
Then what happened?
I punched her.
You punched the bear?
Yeah, well, I couldn't think anything else to do, so I socked her one in the nose. Then
Where was your gun?
She was sitting on it. I just kind of laid back down, and she grabbed my leg, started shaking me around. You know, and I'm moving all over the place.
Grabbed your leg with her teeth?
Yeah. It didn't hurt, really. I felt the teeth go in. You know, it's like more of a sound than a feeling.
After biting, slashing, and shaking Bram like a rag doll, the bear got up and walked away, apparently to check on her cub.
She was circling around staring at me, and I looked at my gun, and I just kind of rolled over and grabbed it, turned, and she was coming back for me, and I shot her.
The bear collapsed. She appeared to be dead. Bram struggled to his feet and looked at his wounds. Even though the attack lasted just seconds, the damage to Bram's body was horrendous.
I looked at my leg, and, you know, and it just looked like, I don't know, little cube steaks and stuff hanging out in my pants. And for a minute, I was standing there, and I'm thinking, where's my hat?
Where's your hat?
I was worried about my hat. I wanted to go get my hat. But it was over by the bear, so I figured I'd leave it there.
Seriously wounded and bleeding, knowing if he sat down he'd never get up, Bram started walking, climbing over deadfall and through mud bogs as darkness fell and the weather turned cruel. He had 9 bullets left after shooting the bear, 9 chances to make some noise, get someone's attention.
I was mad because nobody was coming. I was mad because I had to keep walking. I just kept thinking in my mind, can they make it any worse?
But you had a will to survive, was pretty strong.
Yeah.
Cussedness.
Yeah, I guess. Didn't like the idea of dying on a mountain.
He was bleeding heavily, in unimaginable pain, cursing the bear and the wind and the snow. He stumbled through the woods for about 2 hours. He was down to his last 2 bullets. Then he heard Bruce Pisecki fire that muzzle loader.
My heart just leapt, you know. I'm like, oh boy, somebody's here. I stopped, and I stood there and waited, and I started getting really cold. I started shaking. I started feeling weak, stiffened up. And then when he threw me over his shoulder, it made me dizzy because, you know, all my blood's rushing to the top of my head.
Did you ever know that doctors at one point didn't think you were going to make it?
I had a feeling that that's what they were thinking, but they didn't tell me that.
And just months after the mauling, we watched this young man carry a newborn calf across a pen at the family ranch without so much as a limp.
What has all of this done to you as a family?
I'm driving Bram crazy. Because I just like to have him around and talk to him, and I kind of tend to dote on him.
We brought the Schaefers back to Horseshoe Mountain last August.
Hi, Dennis. Bruce.
And some of the rescuers came too.
Put your leg up. See, I filled in pretty darn good. How's your donor?
It was a chance to show off some wicked scars.
If he wasn't 18 years old, I don't know that he would have bent as well as he did without breaking.
And a grizzly tattoo.
Oh, Bram, man.
Last fall, they were strangers. Now their bond is as strong as any family. For life, they tell us.
I feel honored that they'd let us in to be their friends.
I think they're heroes. They're exceptional people.
His parents believe it was Bram's stubbornness, the kindness of a few strangers, and a heavy dose of fate that saved his life.
It didn't just happen that way. It was meant to be that way.
Do you really believe that?
I really believe that. It wasn't his time. Too many people were in the right place at the right time.
The hunters who helped him agree.
I know there was somebody watching over everybody that night. No doubt.
I believe that angels are just ordinary people and they don't have wings. They just happen to be where they need to be when they need to be there.
Grizzly bear attacks on humans are extremely rare. On average, grizzlies are responsible for 1 human death per year worldwide. If you're traveling in bear country, experts suggest making as much noise as possible. Bears generally try to avoid humans if they know you're coming.